All right, for this first lecture of our second unit called the Progressive Era, I just want to start off by kind of going over that term, Progressive Era. You can see here on the screen, I've put the Progressive Era 1890 to 1920. This is the time period that this next unit is going to talk about. So not quite as long as the Gilded Age, but a pretty similar length of time, and it overlaps some. But when we look at this era from 1890 to 1920 and we say progressive era, I think the important question is, what do we mean by progress? For whom and to where are we trying to get to? If you think about the Gilded Age was an era of progress. Lots of technological inventions and innovations, the growth of the megacity. America became a world leader in industry and production and manufacturing. So in this next era, when we call it a progressive era, it's not that we weren't growing or making progress in the late 1800s, but as we turn the century into the 20th century, where is America going? What is the goal that America wants to progress to, and who is it going to impact the most? You can see in this picture, you'll see a lot of women. And if you really kind of dug into it, these are kind of middle class women, and they're holding signs about labor rights and power and who gets to make decisions and workers' rights and protecting children. There's all kinds of issues. And essentially, when we get to what the progressive era is all about, I'm going to emphasize probably three things. The progressive era is essentially about solving Gilded Age problems, democracy fighting back, and then trying to eliminate inequality, inefficiency, and injustice. And at the heart, behind all of those issues, really the heartbeat of the progressive era is going to be middle-class women. Are we going to talk about, men and presidents and leaders? Sure, there's going to be a lot of that. But probably the pinnacle accomplishment of the progressive era is women in 1920 gaining the right to vote and voting for the first time in national elections. Real quick, let's go through these. Solving Gilded Age problems. The Gilded Age, for all of its good things, also left behind several problems. I've got a chart right here on this that kind of lists out some Gilded Age problems. We will come back to this probably in my last lecture on the progressives, and we'll talk about what really worked or didn't work. But the Gilded Age left behind urban decay and slums, overpowerful monopolies, political machines and political fraud, consumers that needed to be protected, women's inequality, suffrage, just the right to vote, and racial segregation and discrimination. These are all things that, despite the growth of the Gilded Age, these were still areas that America needed progress in. Eventually, what's going to happen is muckrakers. These are journalists, and you're going to have a discussion board post on this tomorrow. But muckrakers are going to step up to kind of investigate these issues and expose these issues to the public. There's going to be activists and reformers who step into these issues and take on a cause to fight to fix these problems. And then finally, there's going to be progressive era solutions, laws, amendments, court cases, systemic changes that try to address these. So over the course of the unit, we will look at all of this, and I'll come back to this at the end of the unit as kind of like a study guide. But the progressive era is essentially about solving those Gilded Age problems. It's also about democracy fighting back. So if you remember at the very beginning of our Gilded Age unit, we said capitalism, this kind of every man for themselves, survival of the fittest mindset, was triumphing over the American values of everybody's equal and everybody has a vote and everybody has a say. The progressive era is about democracy fighting back. There's going to be a push to expand the vote, both for women, the 19th Amendment, and to just vote for more things like our senators. There's going to be grassroots campaigns for other amendments like prohibition, the banning of alcohol, or to try to end child labor. The progressive era is really about democracy fighting back. And finally, inequality, inefficiency, and injustice. Anywhere that the system was abusing a certain group of people or treating somebody as the outsider, whether that be the immigrant, the African American, women, or just generally those who had obstacles, the progressive era and the progressive era reformers are going to step in and say, hey, how can we make this more efficient? How can we eliminate that injustice? And that is a big issue. So now to wrap up, I just want to give you a couple quotes that kind of get you to the heart of what the progressive era is. This first quote, I have this book on my shelf. It's by a guy named Michael McGurr. It says, The Rise and Fall of the Progressive Movement. He says, I believe that progressivism was a radical movement, though not by the common measures of economic and political radicalism. Essentially, he's saying progressivism is not communism, it's not dictatorship, it's not fascism. But progressives were radical in their conviction that other social classes must be transformed and in their boldness in going about the business of that transformation. The essential audacity of the enterprise can be missed. Progressives demanded a social transformation that remains at once profoundly impressive and profoundly disturbing a century later. If you think back to the problems of the Gilded Age, poor immigrant factory workers, child laborers, African Americans who are, even though they are now free from slavery, are not being offered all political rights in terms of social opportunities, voting, economic opportunities, education. Of course, women not having the right to vote in most states. Progressives demanded a social transformation. It's impressive. And then 100 years later, a century later, when we look at some of the obstacles that those groups are still facing, it might be disturbing. Lastly, women are at the heart of this progressive movement. And even though in most states women did not have the actual vote, they did have the moral conscience. They did have the courage to stand up, the ideas to solve some of these problems. This is from a historian named Catherine Sklar. She says, women's collective action in the progressive era certainly expressed a maternalist ideology, a set of ideas that women's roles as mothers gave them a responsibility to care for society as well. But it was also sparked by a moral vision of a more equitable distribution of the benefits of industrialization. Within the political culture of middle-class women, talented leaders combined with grassroots activism to produce an impressive force. Talented leaders combined with grassroots activism to produce an impressive force for social, political, and economic change. This idea that the driving force behind progress, if the Gilded Age, in some senses, were about the men who built America, the progressive age can be about the women who built America. It can be about the women who kind of changed the course and redefined what progress was and where it would go. Okay, that's a start for the progressive era. Tomorrow you'll learn a little bit about muckrakers, and then I'll be back with another lecture next week. All right, thanks, guys.